Welcome to the Dialogue Book Report, where we talk about literature of interest to LDS readers. I'm Andrew Hall, an editor at Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, coming to you from Fukuoka, Japan. And I'm joined by two of my great fellow book readers, Kline, who is the nonfiction book review editor at Dialogue and is the incoming editor-in-chief, co-editor-in-chief with Margaret Olson Hemming. Caroline is a research assistant professor at Claremont Graduate University, where she's the assistant director of the Center for Global Mormon Studies. Caroline, welcome.
Thank you.
And we're also joined by Andrew Hamilton, who's been doing this with me for several years. He is the book review editor at the Association for Mormon Letters and teaches English at the College of Southern Idaho. Andrew, welcome.
Hello, thank you, Andrew.
So today we're going to talk about books published in 2024 in Mormon studies and Mormon literature. We're going to be looking at the best books published in history, creative nonfiction, memoir, literature, and the arts. And we have some great readers here with me today, so I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. So Caroline, I think you're going to first tell us about some collections of nonfiction.
Yeah, I wanted to start off talking about 50 Years of Exponent 2 by Katie Rich and Heather Sundahl. This is published by Signature. And this is both a history book and an anthology of essays. So full disclosure here, I actually have been involved with Exponent 2 for about 20 years. And I did write an introduction to one of the sections in the book. So I am obviously not an impartial person. I have loved Exponent 2 for years, and its vision and its community has been really important to me. So this book, like I mentioned, is half history of the organization and half an edited collection of essays from Exponent 2 publications. For those of you who are not super familiar with Exponent 2, it was established as an independent publication in 1974, the brainchild of Claudia Bushman, and founded on the dual platforms of feminism and Mormonism. Now, the history section of the book is a great read. It's conversational, it's snappy, it's filled with interesting anecdotes, and it's also just fabulous because it highlights all these interesting things like the tensions that the organization had to negotiate over the last 50 years, tensions like how feminist to be, how to navigate hot button issues, whether or not to listen to church leaders that were advising them to stop publishing, etc. And what comes through is that through all this messiness, the organization has over and over again landed on privileging connection and community over ideological purity. And in this way, it's just really embraced that vision of lifting up LDS women's voices. The second part of the book, as I mentioned, does feature a selection of writings, articles, blog posts from Exponent 2's past. And I love this section as well because you just get such a sense of the diversity and richness of women's voices within Mormonism. So all in all, this is just a wonderful, warm vision of a remarkable community filled with moving and important writings. The second book I wanted to mention, which is very much connected to the first book that I just talked about, is the memoir I, Claudia by Claudia Bushman, published by Greg Kofford. Again, I am not impartial here since I do know Claudia. I spent 3 years taking classes with her at Claremont Graduate University. And B, I actually wrote a very brief introduction to this book. Now, Claudia is a remarkable character and a seminal figure in Mormon feminism. The book is chronological and details the various portions of her life. And throughout, she's frank, she's thoughtful, and the book is just filled with her characteristic wit. The chapters discuss her childhood in San Francisco, her time in Boston as a college student, motherhood, and just all these amazing projects that she carried out throughout her life. And what I loved about the book is that throughout it all, she does not shy away from the hard things. She talks about her weaknesses, her failures, her disappointments, as well as her many triumphs and many joys. I found myself just moved by this book because it is so Claudia. It's open, it's real, it's brave, and it stands as a living testament of what she has taught so many women like me, which is write your story down, put words on paper, don't sanitize things, and go out there and make things happen in the world. There is no one else out there like Claudia. She's a model for us all, and we are very lucky to have this book. A very quick FYI on the subject of Claudia Bushman, there will be a conference at the University of Utah on March 15th honoring her and her work. So stay tuned for more information on that.
Great. Claudia and Dick are very dear to me. I spent many days in New York City on their couch when I would come and visit when I was a graduate student in Pittsburgh in the 90s. And we have actually a long connection with them. So it's great to hear. I'm excited about that. So Andrew, speaking of historians talking about their lives and their work, I believe that you are interested in a similar book.
Yes, and just really quickly, before we move on, following up from 50 Years of Exponent 2, I don't know how well you can see this. They also did this fun Illuminating Ladies, a coloring book of Mormon women, Exponent 2 coloring book that you can get from them that covers everyone from Lucy Mack Smith to Olene Walker and just kind of all sorts of fun little feminist Mormon connections. And they did a series of feminist Mormon candles as well. You can't read them, I guess, but most of them are authors and other fun stuff. So lots of great things relating to Exponent 2. So yes, I had several books, actually, I wanted to mention that were memoir related. The first one that's a little bit the most like what we just mentioned is Writing Mormon History 2 by my friend Joseph Geisner. I don't know how Joe's pulled it off. He probably knows more like Mormon writers than anybody that has ever lived. Like this guy has somehow met pretty much every historian that was alive during his lifetime and managed to become friends with all of them. And back in 2020, he did Writing Mormon History 1, which told the stories of various historical writers like Will Bagley and others and how they came about writing their famous books and different things. And now we've got a second version, Writing Mormon History 2, and this one compiles 17 different authors telling their stories. And it's really neat how wide a variety this book covers. You've got writers from the various universities and academic presses, as well as writers that have worked for Desert Book. You've got a number of minorities. You've got queer authors. You've got African-American authors. You've got just a wide variety of people telling their stories about how they came to write the various books and things they did. A little bit of their personal stories are involved. And if you've ever kind of liked to know the rest of the story, this kind of gives you, the stories behind writings by people you'll be familiar with, like Taylor Petrie, Alice Faulkner Birch, Jill Mulvey-Durr, Rick Grunder, Matthew Bowman, and so many others, and telling the stories of how they came to do the various writings that they have done. So if you like kind of history and background and personal stories, it's a great, fun little book. A few of the other things I wanted to touch on. This has been a great year for queer-related Mormon writing. It actually started right at the end of 2023 when in December, I had to go back and double check. I can't quite remember if it's the beginning of 2024 or the end of 23, but right at the end of 23, Signature Books released Chosen Path, the memoir of D. Michael Quinn. And then this year, this has been followed up by several excellent books, including Dictates of Conscience, From Mormon High Priest to My New Life as a Woman by Laurie Lee Hall. Laurie Lee Hall converted to the church in her college years and went on a mission, eventually became a bishop, became a stake president, became the head architect for the church, designing temples, designing the transition of the Provo Tabernacle into a temple, doing a major redesign of the MTC and another of other major projects for the church. All this time living with the secret that they were transgender. They finally began to transition and come out. Coming out everywhere but work at first. And because of this, they eventually had to leave their job and then lost their membership in the church and are now living fully as a Laurie in their kind of authentic self. And they have told their story in this book. And it's just a beautiful and wonderful story, very fascinating. You get to see some kind of the inner workings of the church as they talk about their experience designing these temples and other things, their interactions with leaders, as well as their personal journey from being a closeted transgender individual to being fully out and transitioned. Another great related book, The Boughs of Love, Navigating the Queer Latter-day Saint Experience During an Ongoing Restoration by Nathan Kitchen. This one is from the By Common Consent Press. And Nathan was the head for some time of Affirmation. And he kind of tells his story and the things that they were able to accomplish while he was leading Affirmation, and just the many wonderful things that have come about. Now he has found joy in his life with his husband and other things, and just a wonderful, amazing story in there. And then one other related one, The Book of Queer Mormon Joy, edited by Carrie Spencer Prey with a foreword by Carolyn Pearson from Signature Books. Now, several years ago, Carrie did a book through the University of Utah called I Spoke to You in Silence, Oppressed Mormon Genders. And that was kind of all the sad stories of various Mormon minority queer people and the many things they had suffered. So then Carrie kind of went the other way with this book and is now telling kind of the joyful experiences that many of these queer Mormon folk have had. And there's 3 sections in the book. Joy is complicated, joy is defiance and faith, and joy is gratitude from home. And there are 39 stories by various individuals telling their experiences about how they've found joy in their life through coming out, through living as their authentic selves. Some have remained with the church, some have left, but they're all kind of stories of joy and the various things they've managed to accomplish. And a very fun, wonderful, beautiful book. One other memoir I want to mention is The Book of Boughs by Stephen Lodridge from the University of Utah Press. I'll admit, I've got a soft spot for this book. My son and I go camping every summer, and one of our favorite things to do is visit ghost towns. I'm a sucker for ghost towns and old buildings and all the stories kind of connected to them. And this book tells the story of Boughs, Utah, a little town that used to exist just south of Tooele, that was abandoned in the 1970s due to waste issues. It was kind of declared a disaster site. And this story is essentially, think of the Wonder Years, if you remember the Wonder Years from TV in the 1980s. I thought about it so much as I was reading this book. I could kind of hear Joe Cocker singing A Little Help from My Friends in my head as I was reading this book. But it's kind of interesting. It's not a very long book, but the author, Stephen Lodridge, kind of tells the story of his 1 year that he lived in the town in the 1950s when he was 14, and it's kind of a coming of age story. He loses a pet, his family relationships are changing, kind of has the opportunity to maybe get his first kiss and just all sorts of things. And it might kind of sound goofy, but I'll be honest, to me, it was just really kind of a touching, fun, coming of age type thing. And I love this statement from the prologue where it says, all towns that disappear own a history, not just of dates, data, and decline, but of lives lived. The stories in this collection provide a snapshot of life in a settlement now derelict and uninhabitable that once rang with the struggles and joys of human existence. From the distance of 7+ decades, Boughs comes alive again in these tales of 1 year, one family, and one 14-year-old boy, vital with burgeoning energy, innocent adventure, romance, friendship, and family relations. No place dies completely as long as it exists in vivid memory. And I just kind of love that idea and the way that all of these books I've just mentioned kind of preserve this vivid memory and experience and people having these wonderful kind of life experiences. So I know I probably took a lot of time there. I'll shut up and give somebody else turn here for a couple of minutes.
That's great. Thank you. All right. I have a couple more books of personal essays. One, going back to the idea of queer joy, there's a collection of personal essays by a literary author, Points of Tangency by Scott Russell Morris. And we have a review coming out in Dialogue, and they say they embody queer joy. Scott is a queer Mormon who tells a story about meeting and then marrying his now wife, and he remains in his heterosexual marriage. And the reviewer says, by writing a review about being gay and Mormon, you're inevitably going to be held up as some sort of exemplar for others. I've read plenty of books in this genre. I don't want to read another that felt like a manual for being gay and Mormon. But this book isn't that. Rather, it contains a series of slices of life, embracing uncertainty, nuance, ambiguity, and room for growth. And like I say, it's a lot about joy. It's a lot about finding the joy in little things. And so his queerness is a major background for understanding the book, but it's not always the center of the book and in his essays. Another one is The Last Good Snow Hunt by Joshua DeWain Foster. These are both kind of, university-trained literary authors, personal essay authors. And Joshua Foster is a very skilled essayist who writes about his life in rural Idaho. And it's this book, he's had several books. This one is about a father and son hunting trip, which is used as a basis of a book-length letter to the son concerning families, failure, love, duty, obligation, history, heritage, hunger, and harvest. So I like those two a lot. All right, let's shift from memoir and personal essay to history. So Caroline's going to tell us about some books. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to start out with American Zion by Benjamin Park. Now, this is published by Popular Press, actually. I believe it's an imprint of Norton that published it. And this is a book I definitely recommend, an excellent one-volume history of the church. And I think it's great for a number of reasons. First, it is very readable, or if you're like me, very easy to listen to as an audiobook. He uses a narrative-driven approach. So there's this strong, accessible storytelling. There's colorful anecdotes that keep the reader's interest piqued. And it also just keeps the story rolling forward. And also, second, it tells the story of Mormonism by focusing on a few important themes that come up again and again in Mormon history, like Mormonism's relationship to wider American society and government, as well as all these various internal fault lines within the faith as the church grappled with issues like gender, race, and sexuality, even intellectualism. And because of that, Park is able to show us all these different visions and various people had for Mormonism, different interpretations, different emphases and understandings. And this just adds a lot of interest and complexity to the story. Something I really appreciated about the book also is that Park is careful to include women's voices. For instance, he spends a lot of time with Lucy Mack Smith, Emmeline B. Wells, Amy Brown Lyman, as well as other women that we might not have heard of before. Ultimately, I think this is just a really engaging book that hit on many of the important and well-known stories of Mormonism, but also newer ones that I had never encountered. And I thought his approach was balanced and thoughtful. I highly, highly recommend this book.
Agreed. Very good. A great writer, too. Just fun to read his things. Great.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just such a smooth writer. I will now jump into the second book I was going to mention, which is Second Class Saints, Black Mormons and the Struggle for Racial Equality by Matthew Harris. And this is from Oxford. Now, this is a very important, if at times disheartening, examination of the priesthood temple ban, the revelation that lifted it, and the legacy of the ban. This book is very detail-oriented and draws upon tons of archival research, and it will certainly stand as the most definitive treatment of the ban and the revelation and its aftermath for, no doubt, for decades. This will be the book that people are going to go to. Now, Harris starts out by focusing on the 50-year period that led up to the 1978 revelation. And he discusses what a turbulent time this was, during which some church leaders, many church leaders, opposed civil rights for African Americans. And he just had so many eye-opening and devastating anecdotes about what segregation looked like in the mid-century in Utah, and just the blatant racism that was present in this fear of racial mixing. We go on in the book to learn about the various camps within the 12 apostles in the first presidency. Some of these people were dead set against changing the ban. Some were arguing for the ban's lift, and others were somewhere in the middle. Now, what's really exciting is that Harris got access to all sorts of new, never before analyzed documents, like private papers of church presidents, letters, diaries, meetings of the 12, just all this stuff. And so he's able to show these church leaders' maneuverings, their arguing, their hashing, their rehashing of this topic of the ban. as well as their various understandings about doctrines regarding race. And he also talks about how ultimately, and how huge the role global Mormonism plays in the 1978 revelation, since the ban had just become untenable in places like Brazil, where so many people were mixed race. And finally, he writes about the legacy of these racial teachings and the fact that the church for decades after the revelation did not repudiate the racist doctrines and justifications for the ban. And he writes about the pain that this caused so many members of the Black community. So ultimately, hugely important book. It made it to number 1 on Ben Park's top 10 Mormon history books of 2024. So you know that this is a landmark book. Very good.
Thank you. Okay, Andrew, tell us about some history books you're interested in.
All right. So the first book I want to mention is actually kind of the prequel to the book that Caroline just mentioned, and it is called This Abominable Slavery, Race, Religion, and the Battle Over Human Bondage in Antebellum, Utah. It also came out this year from Oxford Press, and it kind of explains the origins of the priesthood ban and where it all kind of came from. For many years, the talk that was given by Brigham Young to the 1852 legislature was not actually available. It was never printed in the Journal of Discourses or the other common areas. And LeJean Purcell Carruth provided a transcript. And then these authors together have analyzed and given kind of the background and the history of everything that was going on that led to the ban taking place. So utilizing recently transcribed accounts of the 1852 Utah Territorial Legislature, they analyzed this kind of various things that were happening, including converts who were abolitionist pioneers from New England, with the addition of converts who were Southern slaveholders, and 1852 federal laws banning slavery, Indian slavery, all sorts of other things that are kind of going on at the same time, and how the church was kind of coming to terms with all of these, the racism and things that were going on. Brigham Young then announcing that blacks were cursed and they had contaminated blood and they couldn't hold the priesthood, and all in the Civil War and some of the other things that kind of occurred to create the temple and priesthood ban in the first place, and really set that out. So really almost need to have both of these books in your library to kind of get the full picture, how it started, why it kept continuing, and how it eventually came to its conclusion. Two fascinating, very kind of sad additions. Please, sir.
And Paul Reeve, one of the co-authors, of course, has also led the Century of Black Mormons project at the Institute of Utah, which has been really important for getting all these documents available for scholars to use in the future as well. So,
100, and I think they've got those available online, many of those, right?
Right.
So yeah, fascinating resources. The next one I wanted to mention is called Secret Covenants, New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy, edited by Cheryl Bruno. Now, I know a lot of you are about to skip to the next section of this podcast button because you're thinking, great, another book on polygamy. Do we really need one of those? And I'm going to say yes. Actually, this is a very important and fascinating book. One of the reviewers I had who wrote a review for this wrote, after almost 200 years and more than a century since the practice ceased, the specter of polygamy continues to vex the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which echoes Carolyn Pearson's book, The Ghosts of Eternal Polygamy, right? This is something that really kind of haunts the church and a lot of people think about. And there's so much going on in relation to polygamy studies right now. So this book compiles 12 essays by a number of different scholars, including Claire Barris, Mark Tensmeyer, Christopher Smith, Don Bradley, Susan Staker, Mary Clements, and many others. And they cover a variety of important topics. One of the interesting things that's going on right now is this kind of group of members of the church who are almost kind of denying that Joseph Smith was ever involved in polygamy, and it was started by Brigham Young, and other things that are not accurate or historical. So those kind of things get addressed in this book. Don Bradley addresses Joseph Smith's relationship with Fanny Alger. You have just a number of fascinating things going on. Cheryl herself talks about why Emma denied that polygamy happened and the traumas that she went through and other things that went on. So it's really kind of a fascinating and important book that gives us a very important look into the current state of research and scholarly things going on, the study of polygamy, but presents it in a way that the common reader can read it and understand it. And really is a great book to get a hold of if you want to understand the full picture of Mormon polygamy better.
All right, thank you. Now, we have a lot of biographies to talk about. It's been a real bumper crop of biographies the last 3 years, especially since both Signature Press and University of Illinois Press have been doing these short biography series, encouraging these relatively short books that focus on one person. So we have several to talk about there. Andrew, you want to start with that?
Oh, sure, I'll do that. So when I went on my mission, there were 2 books that every elder just about really tried to get a hold of, even though we weren't supposed to have them. One of those was Mormon Doctrine by Bruce R. McConkie, and the other, which I'll touch on more a little later, was Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Now, I turned 12 just a few weeks before Bruce R. McConkie gave his final General Conference talk. So that was kind of the first time my parents forced me to sit down and I was supposed to pay attention. So on my first memory, you might say, of General Conference is Bruce R. McConkie's kind of famous last talk. So I'd long been fascinated by him and this influence that Mormon doctrine had on me on my mission. And so I loved this book that Devery Anderson wrote, Bruce R. McConkie, Apostle and Polemicist, 1915 to 1985. And even though it's only about 200 pages long and it's part of this brief introduction series, Devery has done a great job of just really analyzing McConkie's life and painting a very fair picture of him as a human being and as a church leader and as a family man and an author. And you kind of get this really great picture for just who he was and some of the fun and funny stories behind his life, and just really a great little biography to read. And I really enjoyed it, and the great understanding that he gave me of Bruce R. McConkie's life. Another great biography that also came out from Signature this year. So that was my first kind of General Conference experience. Then I'll be honest, I became a teenager, didn't really pay attention. Went on my mission. The very first General Conference of my mission happened to be the very last one for Marion D. Hanks. And I became absolutely fascinated with Marion D. Hanks when he gave his final conference talk called A Loving and Communicating God. And as I began to find out more about him, I found out he was really a fascinating individual. And so I loved when his son released this year, To Be a Friend of Christ, The Life of Marion D. Hanks. And it's a pretty hefty book. It's close to 600 pages long, and you get this great picture of this man who wasn't afraid to kind of stand up to the other brethren when necessary, and was really a man who kind of stood up for the common church member and pushed back against things like the priesthood and temple ban and treatment of minority members of the church and others, and really did throughout his life and ministry communicate this idea of a loving, communicating God that really cared about his children. And if you want a really good book that is both academic and also feel good and gives you a greater picture for, just a wonderful man and the kind of things he taught, read To Be a Friend in Christ, The Life of Marion D. Hanks. Just a very fascinating, great book. And then I'll mention a couple of short ones quickly from those are both from Signature. These are from the University of Illinois Press series of brief biographies. Joseph Fielding Smith, a Mormon theologian, by Matthew Bowman, and Joseph White Musser, a Mormon fundamentalist, by Christina Rossetti. Both of these are only about 100 pages long, but they still paint us an absolutely fascinating picture. Joseph Fielding Smith, of course, prophet of the church in the early 1970s, a very important theologian. Bowman really focuses on how he's probably the kind of major theologian for the church in the 20th century. Talks a lot about how his life was shaped by kind of the traumas of his early life when his parents had to go into hiding over polygamy, over losing two wives to he was never polygamous. He came after polygamy, and he had 3 wives because he outlived the first 2, and how that affected him and his desire to keep the church kind of being very kind of old-fashioned, and his fight against modernization. And then Joseph Light Musser, who was a Mormon polygamist fundamentalist, by Christina Rossetti, and she paints a very interesting picture and gives this wonderful, interesting, fascinating book describing him and the things that he did in the polygamy movement in the 20th century. So 2 great little books that are really worth checking out there.
Okay, Caroline, tell us about another book.
Yes, I wanted to mention a book that's in that same series that Andrew just mentioned. And this is Sonia Johnson, A Mormon Feminist by Christine Talbot, University of Illinois Press, and it's part of that Introductions to Mormon Thought series. So by highlighting this book, you can see I've got quite the theme going. When it comes to Mormon feminism, that's certainly an interest of mine. And this book focuses on the polarizing figure of Sonia Johnson, who was excommunicated in 1979 for her activities and statements. Talbot writes about Johnson coming to understand that patriarchy was wrong, unethical, harmful, and how she threw herself into pro-ERA advocacy, which, of course, was a dangerous stance to take in the late 1970s when the church had come out against the ERA. Johnson was outspoken, she was bold, and she was committed to exposing some of the underhanded tactics that the church was using to fight ratification of the ERA. Certainly, Sonia Johnson is a figure that inspires strong feelings, and for many more Orthodox Latter-day Saints, she probably inspires a certain amount of animosity and fear. She's even been a cautionary tale to Mormon feminists of what can happen if you go too far. But I think this book does a good job of demystifying her to some extent and showing that she started her journey as a believer trying to reconcile her new understandings about women and women's equality with the stances and teachings of her faith tradition. I think Talbot gives us a measured account of Sonia's actions and helps readers understand why Johnson did what she did. Certainly, people may read this book and see Johnson making mistakes that were damaging and polarizing in their view, but the book certainly shows that she was acting out of deep conviction, that women needed equal rights under the law, and that the LDS Church was a bad actor in the way it fought against ERA and held up the patriarchy. So ultimately, I think this is Sonia Johnson's an important figure, and this is a great addition to the series.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, now let's shift to the arts and literature. Starting with the arts, Caroline, tell us about Latter-day Saint art, Critical Reader.
Yes, this is a book edited by Amanda Beardsley and Mason Allred, and I certainly do want to recommend it. It's a beautiful book that includes over 200 color images of visual art that was created by, for, or about Mormons. It's, like I mentioned, beautiful, but it's also illuminating from an academic perspective because the 22 chapters are using the lens of art history to explore a bunch of important topics, whether it's race, Mormon theology, feminism, or etc. And we can see in these chapters that new insights emerge when one focuses on visual art as opposed to other kinds of data. For example, one fun chapter is by Colleen McDaniel, where she examines institutional decisions in selecting artwork for temple interiors. And she talks about how in the last couple of decades, old paintings have been swapped out for newer, more inclusive and global ones. And she then explores the impact of this art and what it's doing in this ritual space. Other chapters I was drawn to were Jenny Reeder's exploration of 19th century LDS women's folk art and Amanda Beardsley's article on Latter-day Saint feminism and art. So anyone interested in Mormonism, art, visual culture, certainly you should check out this book.
Yeah, it includes, like you say, visual culture, pretty wide scope, including film, and we got a review coming out of that pretty soon. That's I think it'll be very interesting. So, okay. Let me tell you about some novels that are coming out this year. First, Visitations by Corey Egbert. Corey Egbert is an illustrator. He's illustrated for The Friend and other church magazines. And he published a YA graphic novel through National Press. And it's an excellent graphic novel based on his own experiences when his mother kidnapped him and his sister when they were children. And it depicts his struggle as a boy, trained in religious faith and devotion to his family, to understand his beloved mother's choices, which he originally believed to be inspired, but then as she becomes increasingly paranoid and delusional about her ex-husband, Egbert's father, he comes to realize that his faith, that he needs to look at his faith a little more critically, including his faith in his mother. It's very charitable to everyone, all the people in the family, very emotionally rich. So I was very surprised by this. It's, like I say, it's a YA graphic novel, but it's, I think, very well done and will appeal to any reader. He's a great artist as well. Another book is Tales of Kelm First Ward by James Goldberg, Nicole Wilkes Goldberg, and Matthias Singh. These are a collection of very much linked stories of a ward in Eastern Europe. It's based on Eastern European Jewish folk tales. Particularly this folk tale of an angel who accidentally spilled a bag of fools all in one place. So there's a tradition in Eastern European Judaism of this town called Kelm, this town where supposedly all the fools are gathered, and these tales are often kind of the things the fools do are too similar to what we do, and kind of a way of being a satire of humanity. But so they do a Mormon version of this. And James and Matthias, who are brothers, and they have a Jewish heritage, so they're very much drawing on the Jewish heritage. And then James' wife, Nicole, they take these ideas of these folktales and imagines a contemporary LDS ward of Jews in a town in Poland, today. And so there's 32 different stories. For example, Fruma Selig, a Relief Study president, who loves to magnify her calling, and recently learned much to her distress that it was tragic to have a child marry outside the church. Someone said, "Oh, it's so too bad they married outside the church." And she tries to understand what this means, and she thinks after a series of meetings with other of the fools in the ward council, they decide it must mean that marrying somebody who lives outside the geographical borders of the ward is what this means. And so she's very upset because she has one daughter who's getting married in the temple, but that's all the way in Freiburg, Germany, and that's outside the ward. But she has another daughter who's getting married in the local town hall, and that's inside the ward, and so that's okay. So that's inside the church, she thinks. And so you're tempted to correct Fauna. This is a review. I'm quoting from the viewer right now. You're tempted to correct Fruma to explain that marriage that starts in a temple is the kind of in-marriage that their church is encouraging. But then you pause and you listen and you realize that perhaps the secret to a happy marriage lies more in the ongoing support of a community and less in a single location. And like Fruma, you begin to suspect that everything was somehow all right. So it's just very satirical, but of some of the kind of foolish ideas that we have in the church, but also very loving. Just a beautiful collection, and going from young women and primary characters and older characters and all kinds of things. So, it could have been cruel or condescending in other people's hands, but they have a real warmth and affection for these good fools, and all the stories are illustrated as well. So I highly recommend that the Tales of the Kelm First Ward. Some other books, other novels. Desperate Measures by Thomas Rogers, is historical fiction about the Aiken murders in 1857. This is on some murders that happened just months after the Mountain Meadows massacre, and involved more in law enforcement. And it was one of the things that helped spark the Utah War, the invasion by Johnson's army, and he has relatives that were involved that were some of these Utah law enforcement that did the murders. And this trial that was very poorly done trial, I guess, where they're acquitted. So, and he did a play about this, and then he turned this into a novel. So, Tom Rogers, let me just say, he passed away in 2024, just a few months before the book was published. He was a scholar and teacher of Russian literature at BYU, a playwright, and author of fiction and nonfiction, and a faithful leader of great spiritual and intellectual depth and breadth. He's probably best known in our purposes as a playwright of Huebner, a 1976 play about Helmut Huebner, a German LDS boy in 1942 who was, at the age of 17, was executed by the Nazi regime for producing anti-Nazi leaflets. and also about the branch president who, trying to protect his branch, and also because he was a Nazi sympathizer, excommunicates Huebner after his arrest. Huebner was posthumously had his membership reinstated after the war, but it's a play about conscience and obedience. It was a huge hit at BYU in 1976. It was a big deal. People nobody knew about the story, and people were excited about it. But then church leadership asked that there be no future performances of the play, and a planned production in California was canceled, and that ban kind of remained until 1990 when the Iron Curtain was lifted, and then after that there were several productions. It's, I think, a really key work in Mormon literature. It encourages us to think about the competing loyalties of freedom and obedience. And then he went on to write other remarkable plays, many about Mormons facing difficult moral choices, one about John D. Lee. Several plays set in Russia are based on Russian literature. He served as a mission president in Moscow in the early 1990s and was later a traveling LDS patriarch assigned to the former Soviet Union. He went 24 times to Europe and Russia and bestowed over 2,600 patriarchal blessings. So, and I just think he's an amazing person. I took his class on Tolstoy at BYU when I was a first-year student. One of the hardest classes I ever took. He had us read all of War and Peace and Anna Karenina and Resurrection and a ton of other stuff all in one semester. But that's also the seminar where I met my wife, Jennifer. So we have a soft spot for him in our hearts. Okay, a few other works. Journey from a Desert Road by Mary Clyde. Mary Clyde did a series of great short stories in the 90s, and then I hadn't heard of her for a while. I was always wondering what happened to her, and she came out with this novel this year about a family where an adult son has been in an accident, and he's in a coma, but in his coma, he has this whole story that he's seen of himself in a post-apocalyptic or apocalyptic, an atomic bomb, and trying to bring people to safety. So we have half the stories about the things that he's seen, in these visions, and then half the stories about his mother, who's Mormon heritage and comes from a Mormon community, although not active herself, and struggling to keep the family together with that. And it's got very good reviews. Brandon Sanderson, the extremely famous fantasy author, has completed the Stormlight Archive, or at least the first segment of the Stormlight Archive, this huge multi-volume epic fantasy. This is the 5th volume, and he includes it's an epic fantasy, in another world, but he includes a lot of very Mormon ideas in it. There's like a kind of a Mormon Satan in it, and very interesting arguments for the need for atonement, implications about the importance of belief in characters' lives, especially those who are not traditional believers. He's recently working to include much more LGBT type characters in his work as well, and so he's gotten kind of a lot of note for that. But anyways, he publishes a lot. He's constantly, he's an amazing author who publishes a ton of works. But this Stormlight Archive is probably the thing that's he's getting the most attention for recently. Also, the Ali Kandi, who is a popular YA novelist, she wrote the Matched series that was very popular. She has her first novel for adults called The Unwedding, a mystery, which is a great mystery, kind of a locked room type mystery, but also a very intimate and personal book about recovering from a surprising divorce and the grief that comes from that. And so you come into this kind of genre novel of a mystery, but then it also turns into this quite deep and well done observation of a woman recovering from grief. So I think she's a great author. Okay, so there's some novels that I'm very interested in. Andrew, you had a couple other novels you want to tell us about, right?
Yes, I did. So the first one is Cigarettes and Saints by Kira Shea. That's a self-published book, and it is a very thick book. This book is like over 700 pages long. So it's a very, very thick novel. It is a bit of an investment in your time, but I feel it is very worth it. I found this book to be absolutely fascinating. Now, I will give a little bit of a warning. It is kind of graphic and intense. She uses frequent explicit language, and there's explicit references to sex and other things in here. But if you're familiar, say, the writings of Lydia Yukonovich, like A Chronology of Water, or A Bastard Out of Carolina by Dorothy Allison, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou, I feel it compares to this kind of style of writing in these authors, and she uses this graphicness to come to terms with the abuse that she went through. She grew up in a very impoverished family, bad side of Provo. A lot of you don't know there was a bad side of Provo, but there is, and a very abusive family where there's a lot of drug use and other things. And she uses this form of writing to kind of deal with all the things that are going on in her life as she transitioned out of the church and went out of her marriage and other things. And for me, it's a very important and interesting book that kind of deals with her coming to terms with all these things and might help other people who maybe themselves are leaving the church or have a loved one who has, and they're trying to understand that a little more, or who have had or known people that have dealt with or experienced abuse and some of these other things. And so a very interesting and fascinating book, quite artistic in its presentation. One of the reasons why it's so big is it has a lot of art in it. The font changes frequently in size and scope and spacing and other things. It also has a little companion volume, Cigarettes and Saints, poetry from the novel, that includes a lot more art and poetry and other things. So kind of an interesting take on Mormonism and things relating to that. The other one I wanted to mention is Immortal Blood by Meddy Ivy Harrison. Now, I'll admit, I'm a big Meddy Harrison fan. I've read just about all of her Mormon-related novels. She has a lot of general press novels she's done as well. But this is the fourth book in her Vampires in the Temple series. And now, if you're not familiar with that, the first book was called Vampires in the Temple, and it's kind of set in an alternate reality where a lot of stuff is similar. The United States is there. Joseph Smith, had a vision in 1820, started the church in 1830. Brigham Young and the church came west in 1846 and found vampires living in Utah when they got here and chased them all off to Antelope Island. And now we're in kind of modern times. And the lead character in the books is Jack, who's a werewolf, and he has a younger sister. And by this time, he's got a girlfriend, Janie, and she's now immortal from getting infused with some vampire blood. And there's all these things going on as this group of immortals is kind of trying to take over the world. And how do the vampires come into it? How do the werewolves come into it? How does the church relate to it? The prophet that has become the leader of the church, right, as this novel is beginning, is very anti-vampire and is putting these kind of anti-vampire teachings into the church. So she uses it as kind of an allegory for how like queer members of the church are being treated and addressed through various things that have gone on, and like much good science fiction does, with using allegories to kind of relate to subjects in real life. And I fell in love with this series so much, I kind of talked BCC and Meddy into give me a sneak peek. So I've got the manuscripts for the last two books in this series as well. And you'll want to get this book in this series if you haven't had them. They're fun, they're interesting, they're great, and give you kind of some fun stories and allegories again. And absolutely love these. Check them out. They're very fun little stories to read.
Great, thank you. All right, let me talk about two short fiction collections by authors who have published in Dialogue in recent years, Ryan Habermeyer and David G. Pace. So Ryan Habermeyer has his first, well, not his first, sorry, but he has a new collection of short fiction called Salt Folk, which is very much of a theme. It's a collection of very experimental, he's a very experimental author, and often bleak and absurd short stories set in and around Utah, often a Utah that's in the midst of ecological catastrophe. So he has these things like a Yeti who's forced by the oil and gas companies into a retirement community in Utah after his glaciers in the Himalayas melt. And then a mysterious glacier appears in the barren lake bed of the former Great Salt Lake and only grows if we feed it our joy. It's a very strange things. And but anyways, he's got an interesting mind. And so Salt Folk by Ryan Habermeyer. Also mostly more on the realistic side is American Trinity and Other Stories from the Mormon Corridor by David G. Pace. And these are very moving set of short stories about focusing on Mormon Americana. Pace is a post-Mormon person, but he looks at Mormon society with a critical but also loving look. And I think most remarkable is the title tale, American Trinity, which is the first-person account by Zed, one of the three Nephites, and his experiences throughout the centuries, following his calling to remain on earth until the second coming of Christ. Yes, it's a very interesting story. So, American Trinity into the stories. All right, let's switch away from literature and go to some academic nonfiction about Mormonism. Caroline.
Yeah, I wanted to start off with Taylor Petree's Queering Kinship in the Mormon Cosmos. This is published by University of North Carolina Press. And I really enjoyed this book. I like constructive works where a person takes, say, various Mormon teachings, history, scriptures, and then refashions or reinterprets them to open up new liberative possibilities. And this is what Petree has done in this book, where he employs queer theory to disrupt and destabilize traditional understandings of Mormon theology and its heteropatriarchy, which, of course, so many Latter-day Saints take as given, absolute, immovable. For example, one of Petree's earliest chapters in the book explores the LDS Godhead and teases out the various ways that Mormon understandings of the Godhead can actually be read as challenging heteronormative understandings. In this chapter, he highlights the ungenderedness or conflicting understandings of the gender of the Holy Ghost. He also talks about the homoerotic language used to describe Jesus and God the Father's relationship with one another, which, often uses words like, indwelling or interpenetrative. Other chapters similarly gives us exciting liberative readings. I particularly liked his queer readings of the creation story, which just opened up so many possibilities for disrupting heteropatriarchy. For instance, he writes about the, again, ungenderedness of the Adam creature in the scriptures, and reinterprets the scriptural commands to reproduce and multiply. And there's just so much more throughout the rest of the book. All in all, I think that this is a really generative look at the possibilities lying latent within Mormon theology and even history for expanding notions of the family and kinship to include all sorts of other possibilities. It's very creative, and ultimately, it's actually hopeful for those who hunger after a Mormonism that is less bound to heteropatriarchy. I also wanted to talk about the book Forever Familias, Race, Gender, and Indigeneity in Peruvian Mormonism by Jason Palmer. This is from the University of Illinois Press. People often say that the next untapped field within Mormon studies is global Mormon studies, particularly global Mormon studies books and articles that decenter the experiences and thoughts of white North America and focuses instead on what Mormonism means and is to people from around the world. And here we have just that in Jason Palmer's book, which is the product of many years of fieldwork with Peruvian Mormons. Palmer is an anthropologist, so that itself is unique for a Mormon studies book. The book is rich, it's complex, it draws on a number of important theories, and it is pretty hard-hitting on issues like colonialism, race, and gender within Anglo-Mormon thought. Most interesting is the way that it explores what these categories, like race, gender, etc., mean to Peruvians, where these just don't translate so well. And therefore, Peruvians are actually often able to use these misalignments to revamp or reconfigure typical Anglo-Mormon understandings in order to encompass their own Peruvian understandings and senses of what family is. So in other words, to push back in some senses on Anglo-Mormon understandings. This book is one of a kind in the way it delves into Peruvian Mormons' experiences, and certainly in such depth and with such theoretical sophistication. This is a standout book. And the last book I wanted to mention is a book called Missionary Interests, Protestant and Mormon Missions in the 19th and 20th Centuries. And this is edited by Christopher Cannon-Jones and David Golding, and it's through Cornell University Press. Now, this is an edited volume, and it is important because it's comparative, which is a direction that I think other Mormon studies books will increasingly embrace. Through comparing Protestant missions and Mormon missions, the book's able to deliver a lot of interesting insights and connections and tensions between the traditions, which can actually be really generative. It starts off with a great foreword by Laurie Kipp, who describes Christian missions as a kind of experimental laboratory that can reveal all sorts of things about power, culture, values, identities, cosmologies, and so on. And certainly all those themes resurface again and again in the book's 11 chapters, which are ordered chronologically. Each chapter has a topical focus, such as the role of gender in Protestant missions in the 19th century, or the conception of quote unquote heathens in the minds of American missionaries, etc. So some of the chapters focus on both LDS and Protestant missions, and some just focus on one tradition or the other. Again, this book stands out because of this comparative approach. When traditions are placed side by side, you get these new ideas are produced, distinctions, parallels surface up and become crystallized. And that makes this a really interesting and exciting book.
Okay, thank you. Andrew, tell us about some books you're interested in.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'll take the lead from Caroline mentioning Global Mormon Studies and address a little book from BCC Press called A Documentary History of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in Mexico, 1875 to 1946. And it is very brief. It is just over 170 pages long, and it has 12 chapters in it. And these chapters include both documents as well as writings explaining these documents that cover a lot of very important things in Mexican history relating to the church, with such subjects and people as Moses Thatcher, Ray L. Pratt, the Mexican Revolution and its effect on the church, the history of the Mexico City branch, the Third Revolution in the early 20th century, when a lot of Mexican members decided, hey, we're kind of fed up with the way you white folks in Utah are running the church, we're leaving. And everything kind of tied into that. And
the third convention.
Yes. Sorry. Third convention, not the Third Revolution. Sorry about that. And one of the neat things about this book is it has parallel columns with the documents in the original Spanish as well as English translation in places. So a great little book and resource there. So a kind of a fun one to check out if you're interested in Mexican and Mormon history. A couple others that I want to touch on. So I mentioned earlier kind of the impact of two books on my life, Mormon Doctrine, and then the other, The Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. Originally came out in 1938, compiled by Joseph Fielding Smith from the History of the Church series. It was supposed to be a compilation of writings and talks by Joseph Smith. And from 1938 until recent years, really, that book was kind of the go-to book, right, that most members would go to if they wanted to kind of read something by Joseph Smith and understand him better. And like I said, on my mission, we like to pour over, kind of the deep doctrines that were in there, things like the King Follett sermon and these ideas, and really was just a very influential book in the church. Now, because of the Joseph Smith Papers projects and more things coming out that show that a lot of the documents that were in there were compilation documents, there were additions by scribes, not everything that was in there was actually said by Joseph Smith, no longer as relevant maybe as it once was, but the publishers of this and the authors involved wanted to kind of keep the book relevant and show how it can kind of continue to have an impact on the church. So what they have done is they have created a 2-column style book. This is through Kofford Books, by the way, if I didn't touch on that. And in one column is the original, as found in the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith version of the book. And in the other column is the scholarship and the documents from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, kind of showing what we can show is actually said and what is in the actual documents. And it is also extensively footnoted. So if you were ever, fascinated by, grew up with, studied from, the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and want to see kind of what he actually said and what the documents show that he said and how that kind of relates to modern church scholarship, this is a great and fascinating book to get a hold of. The other one I wanted to mention is the Annotated Book of Mormon. And this is also from Oxford. We mentioned Oxford several times tonight. This is something of a magnum opus, if you will, for Grant Hardy and his academic studies of the Book of Mormon. It is the Book of Mormon text, the 1920 Book of Mormon text, with just all sorts of fascinating and interesting academic things that are really very good, that I quite enjoy and I think are very insightful. So each book, so First Nephi, Second Nephi, etc., starts with an introductory essay, an academic essay explaining the book and its theology and the things that are in it. There's a set of companion essays in the back going into further detail about theology in the Book of Mormon and history and other things that are in there. There are also just really extensive footnotes that connect to world scripture, American literature, inspired fiction, ancient history, and other things that connect. There's little sidebars and little sections that talk about like Isaiah and the Book of Mormon and scholarship that relates to that and all sorts of things. You get all sorts of explanatory charts, explaining genealogies, geography, transmission history. The paragraphing is formatted in kind of a poetic format to make it more readable and to kind of see the poetic flow and arrangement of the text. And really just a wonderful and fascinating take on the Book of Mormon, and a great, if you love Book of Mormon academics and studying the Book of Mormon and want to get a greater picture for kind of an academic picture of the Book of Mormon, a great book to get a hold of. And then I'll throw out kind of one up and coming thing. So a very an individual who's become kind of popular online recently is Daniel McClellan, a member of the church who has a podcast called Data Over Dogma that's on places like YouTube and TikTok, where he addresses what people think the Bible says, both from kind of the perspective of maybe kind of what fundamentalist Christians or traditional Christians might believe the Bible says, even if it doesn't really, as well as kind of the opposite, what like atheists or former Christians might say or think is in the Bible, but maybe really isn't accurate. He will go through the actual scholarship and what the Bible really actually says. And he does it in these little kind of 5 to 10 minute video segments. And the book, The Bible Says So, What We Get Right and Wrong About Scripture's Most Controversial Issues, will be published and released here in April in this year from Dan. And it's going to have all sorts of fun little chapters in it with names like The Bible Says, The Bible is Inspired, The Bible Says God Lies, The Bible Says God Has a Body, and many others where he kind of addresses what people think the Bible says and then what the Bible actually says. So if you've enjoyed his podcast and ever watched any of his little video segments, that'll be a fun and fascinating book to pick up from a national publisher by a church author.
Wow, so many great books. Thank you. Thank you, both of you, for all of your work on this and gathering these things. And I'm excited to read more of these books. And I'm looking forward to another great year of Mormon studies, Mormon literature coming up. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, for listening to the Dialogue Book Report. This show is part of the Dialogue Podcast Network, a collective of independent podcasts who promote inquiry into all aspects of the LDS tradition. That includes wonderful shows like Angels and Seer Stones, a Latter-day Saint folklore podcast, in which folklorists Christina and Christopher Blythe examine the lived religion of Latter-day Saints. And this show is produced and edited by Daniel Foster Smith, who also provides the music. Our content manager is Emily Jensen. To hear more, go to dialoguejournal.com. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings, my name is Rebecca DeSchweinitz, and I'm thrilled to serve as a board member at the Dialogue Foundation and as one of the hosts of Dialogue Gospel Study. In each episode, which we record live the second and fourth Sunday of every month, we welcome esteemed speakers from a variety of backgrounds to share their insights and perspectives on the Come Follow Me lessons. Our aim is to spark meaningful conversations about the scriptures, to connect them to our personal experiences and to our understandings and explorations of the gospel. To stay in the loop with our upcoming lessons and this opportunity to engage with Mormon thought, culture, and belief, be sure to visit dialoguejournal.com and sign up for our newsletter. By doing so, you'll receive updates and timely links to join our live stream lessons. Additionally, you can catch up on our past guests and episodes by subscribing to Dialogue Journal on YouTube, Facebook, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Dialogue Podcast Network.